At exactly 5:30 a.m., Margaret Peggy Thompson walked through the employee entrance of the Grand Plaza Hotel in Boston, just like she had done every morning for the past 35 years. Her gray uniform was perfectly pressed, her dark hair neatly tied back in a practical bun. At 58, her face showed the gentle signs of aging, but her blue eyes remained sharp and observant. "Morning, Peggy." James Chen, the head of maintenance, called out as she signed in. His friendly smile carried a hint of something deeper, a shared secret that no one else in the luxurious hotel could possibly guess. "Good morning, James," Peggy replied warmly, grabbing her cleaning cart. As she pushed it toward the service elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished brass doors. Nobody would ever guess that the humble housekeeper, carefully arranging cleaning supplies, was actually Margaret Blackwood, the rightful owner of not just this hotel, but the entire Blackwood Hospitality Group. As she rode up to begin her morning routine on the executive floor, Peggy's mind drifted to the letter she'd received last night. The private investigator had found something new about her parents' plane crash. "Mechanical failure seems increasingly unlikely," he'd written. After 35 years, she might finally be getting closer to the truth. The elevator doors opened to the familiar sight of the executive floor's plush carpeting. Peggy pushed her cart down the hallway, her movements automatic after so many years. She paused outside the CEO's office, listening carefully before entering. Richard Morrison wouldn't arrive for hours, but caution had become second nature. As she dusted Morrison's massive desk, her eyes lingered on the family photo prominently displayed. Richard stood with his daughter Alexandra, both smiling perfectly for the camera. Peggy's heart tightened. Richard's smile hadn't changed since the day he'd stood beside her father in similar photos, back when he was just a promising young executive the Blackwoods had taken under their wing. "If only you could see what he's done with your legacy, Dad," Peggy whispered, quickly wiping away a tear. She couldn't afford to get emotional, not here. She had a role to play. The sound of approaching voices made her straighten up immediately. Through the open door, she saw Alexandra Morrison strutting down the hallway with two equally well-dressed friends, all clutching takeout coffee cups. "Daddy's planning to expand again," Alexandra was saying, her voice carrying that familiar tone of entitled pride. "3 new hotels by next year. He's basically unstoppable." Peggy kept her head down, dusting methodically as the young women passed. Alexandra didn't even glance her way. The cleaning staff might as well have been invisible. Just like every other day, Peggy said nothing, did nothing. But inside, her determination grew stronger. Later that morning, during her break, Peggy sat in the small employee break room, sipping bland coffee from a styrofoam cup. Sarah Martinez, the hotel's HR manager, dropped into the chair across from her. "Everything okay, Peggy?" Sarah asked kindly. "You seem lost in thought today." Peggy gave her a gentle smile. "Just tired, dear. Nothing to worry about." Sarah leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I found some strange things in the old files yesterday. Documents about the ownership transition back in '89. Some numbers just don't add up." Peggy's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained perfectly calm. "Oh, well, I'm sure Mr. Morrison knows what he's doing," she replied mildly, standing up to rinse her cup. "He always does." As she walked back to her cart, Peggy's mind was racing. After 35 years of patient waiting and watching, things were finally starting to unravel. The truth about her parents' death, the suspicious ownership transfer, Morrison's increasingly aggressive expansion plans, it was all coming to a head. But she had to stay focused. Keep playing her role, keep watching and gathering evidence. One wrong move could destroy everything she'd worked for. She pushed her cart toward the next suite, just another invisible housekeeper in a massive hotel. For now. The next morning brought unexpected chaos to the Grand Plaza Hotel. A last-minute board meeting had been called, and the executive floor buzzed with activity. Peggy noticed Richard Morrison arriving earlier than usual, his face tense as he barked orders into his phone. "No, we need those documents now. The investors are getting nervous," Morrison snapped, barely acknowledging Peggy as she quickly moved her cart aside. "Just get it done." Through the years, Peggy had learned that unscheduled board meetings usually meant trouble. She took her time cleaning nearby, ears alert to every word. "Dad, can we talk?" Alexandra appeared in the doorway of her father's office. "It's important." "Not now, sweetheart. I have a crisis to handle," Morrison replied, shuffling through papers on his desk. "It's about Mom," Alexandra insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "I found some old letters in the attic. Why didn't you tell me she tried to contact you before she—" "I said not now." Morrison's fist came down hard on the desk. Alexandra flinched, and Peggy noticed tears forming in the young woman's eyes before she turned and rushed away. Peggy's heart ached unexpectedly. She remembered Alexandra as a small child, often wandering the hotel halls alone while her father worked. Back then, she would sometimes sit in the break room, coloring pictures while Peggy had her lunch. But that was before the girl learned to look down on the staff. Later that day, Sarah Martinez caught up with Peggy near the service elevators. "The board meeting's about a potential buyout," Sarah whispered. "Some foreign investors want to take over the entire chain. Morrison seems desperate to push the deal through." Peggy's blood ran cold. A buyout would bury the truth forever. "When?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 2 weeks. And Peggy. Sarah glanced around before continuing. "I found something else. Records showing massive payments to offshore accounts right after the ownership transfer in '89. It looks like." The elevator dinged, and they quickly stepped apart as guests emerged. Peggy's mind raced as she pushed her cart into the empty elevator. The timeline was accelerating. She needed to contact her investigator immediately. During her lunch break, Peggy snuck away to call James Chen. "The foreign investors are a front," James told her. "I've been tracking them. The money leads back to some very dangerous people. Morrison's gotten himself into something big." "What about the crash investigation?" Peggy asked. "We found the mechanic who worked on your parents' plane. He's willing to talk, but he's scared. Says Morrison's people have been watching him for years." A commotion from the lobby interrupted their conversation. Peggy hurried to see what was happening, finding Alexandra in a heated argument with her father. "You're lying," Alexandra shouted, waving papers in her hand. "Mom didn't kill herself. These letters prove she was scared of something, of someone." "That's enough." Morrison grabbed his daughter's arm, leading her forcibly toward his office. "You're making a scene." Peggy watched them go, pieces clicking into place. Morrison's late wife, could her death be connected to everything else? She needed to find Alexandra, talk to her somehow. Maybe the girl had found evidence without realizing its importance. But before Peggy could make a plan, she saw Sarah Martinez being escorted out of the hotel by security. The HR manager caught her eye as she passed, giving a slight nod. In her hand, Peggy glimpsed a USB drive. Things were moving too fast now. Sarah had obviously found something significant, something that got her fired immediately. Peggy needed to act soon, but she'd learned the hard way that rushed decisions led to mistakes. She had to be smart about this. As she returned to her duties, Peggy noticed Morrison watching her more closely than usual. Had she somehow given herself away, or was he just getting paranoid as his carefully built world started crumbling? Either way, the game was changing. After 35 years of patience, Peggy would soon have to make her move. The only question was, who would she trust to help her? "Miss Alexandra, please be careful with that coffee. It's very hot," warned a server as he handed Alexandra her morning latte in the hotel's lobby cafe. But she wasn't listening, too busy arguing on her phone. "I don't care what Dad says. I'm going to find out what really happened to Mom." Alexandra paced back and forth, gesturing wildly with her free hand. Not watching where she was going, she collided with Peggy, who was quietly mopping the marble floor. Hot coffee splashed everywhere. Alexandra screamed, not from pain but rage. "Look what you made me do," she shrieked, glaring at Peggy. "This is a $500 blouse." "I'm so sorry, Miss Morrison," Peggy said softly, reaching for her cleaning cloth. "Let me help." "Don't touch me." Alexandra grabbed her still half-full cup and threw the remaining coffee directly at Peggy. The hot liquid hit her chest and face, making her gasp in pain. The lobby fell silent. Guests stopped to stare. Peggy stood perfectly still, coffee dripping down her uniform, her skin burning. "That's what you get for being so clumsy," Alexandra sneered. "Maybe next time you'll watch where you're going." James Chen appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Peggy, are you all right?" He grabbed a clean towel from her cart and handed it to her. "I'm fine. Peggy said quietly, though her hands were shaking. For the first time in 35 years, she felt her careful self-control slipping. "Someone call HR," James shouted, but then remembered. "Oh right, Sarah was fired yesterday. Well, I'm reporting this incident myself." "Report whatever you want," Alexandra laughed. "Nothing will happen, right, Daddy?" Richard Morrison had appeared at the commotion. He took in the scene with cold eyes. Alexandra, go clean yourself up," he ordered. Then to Peggy, "Take the rest of the day off, with pay, of course." "No," Peggy said. Morrison blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no." Peggy straightened up, letting the towel fall. "I've worked here for 35 years. I've been quiet, respectful, invisible. But this ends now. Mrs. Thompson, perhaps you're upset." Morrison started, but Peggy cut him off. "Call the board," she said clearly. "Emergency meeting, this afternoon." Morrison laughed nervously. "I don't think you're in any position to." "Oh, but I am." Peggy's voice changed, losing its servile tone. "Call them, Richard, or I will. And believe me, you'd rather be the one making that call." Something in her voice made Morrison pause. He studied her face carefully, and she saw the moment recognition flickered in his eyes. "It can't be," he whispered. 3 o'clock, Peggy said firmly. "Don't be late." She turned and walked toward the employee locker room, leaving silence in her wake. As she passed Alexandra, the girl's shocked face showed the first hints of fear. In the locker room, James followed her in. "Are you sure about this, today?" Peggy opened her locker and pulled out a garment bag she'd stored there years ago, just waiting for this moment. "Call the mechanic," she told James. "Tell him it's time, and get Sarah Martinez back here with those files." "What about the foreign investors? They're dangerous people, Peggy." "So am I." She unzipped the garment bag, revealing an elegant business suit. "They just don't know it yet." As she changed out of her coffee-stained uniform for the last time, Peggy felt strangely calm. 35 years of hiding, watching, gathering evidence, all leading to this moment. "Time to take back what's mine," she whispered to her reflection. The face looking back at her wasn't Peggy the housekeeper anymore. It was Margaret Blackwood, and she had a score to settle. The Grand Plaza Hotel's main boardroom buzzed with tension at 3 p.m. sharp. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, wondering why they'd been summoned so urgently. Richard Morrison sat at the head of the table, his face ashen, while Alexandra huddled in a corner, still wearing her stained blouse. When the doors opened, every head turned. Margaret walked in wearing her tailored suit, her bearing completely transformed. Sarah Martinez and Detective Michael Brooks followed, carrying files and a laptop. "What is this?" demanded Thomas Wheeler, the board's senior member. "Morrison, why is your housekeeper dressed like that?" "Because she's not my housekeeper," Morrison said quietly, slumping in his chair. "Are you, Margaret?" "No, Richard, I'm not." She stood at the opposite end of the table. "I'm Margaret Blackwood, and this is my hotel." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Alexandra stepped forward, her face confused. "Blackwood, but they died. There was a crash." "My parents died," Margaret corrected. "I survived, and now we know it wasn't an accident." Detective Brooks stepped forward. "We have a signed confession from the mechanic who was forced to tamper with the Blackwoods' plane. He named Richard Morrison as the one who ordered it." Morrison jumped up. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof." "We have proof of everything," Sarah interrupted, connecting her laptop to the room's display screen. "The falsified ownership transfer documents, the offshore accounts, the recent dealings with known criminal organizations." Documents flashed across the screen. Bank statements, contracts, emails. Morrison's face grew paler with each revelation. "Dad," Alexandra's voice shook. "What did you do?" "He killed my parents," Margaret said calmly. "Forced me into hiding, stole my company, and now he's trying to sell it to criminals for money laundering." "You're just like your mother," Morrison sneered at Alexandra. "Always asking too many questions. She should have kept her mouth shut too." Alexandra stumbled back as if struck. Mom didn't commit suicide." "The police are reopening that investigation as well," Detective Brooks added. Morrison lunged for the door, but security guards were already there. James Chen stepped in, holding up his old investigator's badge. "Going somewhere, Richard." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, Alexandra collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Margaret approached her slowly. "I remember you," Alexandra whispered. You used to let me color in the break room when I was little. You were kind to me even after I became this. We all become different people to survive, Margaret said gently. The question is, who do you want to be now? The board members sat in stunned silence as Sarah continued presenting evidence. Years of financial fraud, secret deals, threats against employees who asked questions. As the majority shareholder, Margaret announced, I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove Richard Morrison from all positions and cancel the pending sale. The vote was unanimous. What happens now? Thomas Wheeler asked. Now, Margaret said, we rebuild properly this way. She turned to Alexandra, starting with making things right. Alexandra looked up through her tears. Why would you want to help me after what I did, what my father did? Because 35 years ago I chose justice over revenge, Margaret replied, and I'm not going to change that now. The boardroom slowly emptied, leaving Margaret alone with the empire she'd finally reclaimed. She walked to the window, looking out over Boston. Somewhere her parents were smiling. Justice had taken its time, but it had finally arrived. Behind her she heard Alexandra quietly ask, will you teach me how to run things the right way? Margaret turned, seeing not the spoiled girl who'd thrown coffee at her, but the lonely child who used to color in the break room. Yes, she said, I will. 1 month after Richard Morrison's arrest, the Grand Plaza Hotel hummed with renewed energy. Employees walked the halls with their heads held high, no longer afraid of arbitrary dismissal or mistreatment. Margaret sat in what was now rightfully her office, reviewing the changes she'd implemented. Profit sharing for all employees, better healthcare benefits, educational assistance programs. The hotel was becoming what her parents had always envisioned, not just a luxury establishment, but a community. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Alexandra entered, carrying a stack of reports. The audit team finished their review, she said, setting the files down. They found 3 more shell companies Dad used for moving money. Margaret noticed Alexandra's hands trembling slightly as she arranged the papers. You're doing the right thing, she assured her. Helping the investigation isn't betraying your father, it's choosing truth over lies. I know, Alexandra sighed. It's just, every day we find something new. More people he hurt, more lives he ruined. She paused. I visited him yesterday at the detention center. How did that go? He still won't admit what he did to Mom, but the detective says they have enough evidence now for an arrest warrant. Alexandra's voice cracked. All those years I blamed her for leaving me, but she was trying to expose him, wasn't she? Margaret nodded solemnly. Your mother was very brave, like daughter, like mother. A commotion outside drew their attention. Sarah Martinez was directing a group of workers who were installing a new plaque in the lobby. The Blackwood name was returning to its rightful place. The press is still calling it the Hotel Maid heiress story, Alexandra said, managing a small smile. They can't get enough of it. Let them, Margaret replied. Maybe it will remind people that dignity doesn't come from position or power. It comes from how you treat others. James Chen appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but the employee meeting is about to start in the grand ballroom. Margaret stood, straightening her jacket. No more uniforms for her, but she kept one hanging in her office as a reminder. Alexandra started to leave, but Margaret stopped her. Come with me, she said. They need to see us working together. The grand ballroom was packed with hotel staff, housekeepers, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, front desk personnel. As Margaret took the stage, she saw familiar faces she'd worked alongside for years, friends who never knew her secret but showed her kindness anyway. Today marks a new chapter for the Blackwood Hospitality Group, she began. But first, I want to apologize to all of you. As your coworker, I saw your struggles, shared your hardships, but couldn't act without risking everything. That ends now. She outlined the changes. Better wages, advancement opportunities, childcare assistance. With each announcement, the excitement in the room grew. And finally, Margaret said, I'm establishing a scholarship fund in honor of Catherine Morrison. She glanced at Alexandra, who wiped away tears. For employees' children who dream of working in hospitality management, because everyone deserves a chance to rise. The applause was deafening. As Margaret looked out over the crowd, she saw hope replacing fear in their eyes. This was her parents' true legacy, Not the buildings or the brand, but the belief that success and compassion could go hand in hand. Later, as the sun set over Boston, Margaret stood at her office window. The city lights were coming on, just like they had all those evenings when she pushed her cleaning cart through these halls. But now, finally, she could be herself. "Thank you," she whispered to her parents' photo on the desk. "I did it. We did it." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, justice had won. And in the end, that was worth every minute of those 35 years. 6 months after Richard Morrison's arrest, Margaret stood at the podium during the grand reopening celebration of the renovated Grand Plaza Hotel. The marble lobby sparkled under new chandeliers, but the biggest changes weren't visible. They were in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. "When I first walked through these doors as a housekeeper," Margaret addressed the crowd, "I thought I was starting a mission of revenge. Instead, I found a family." The audience included reporters, business leaders, and most importantly, the entire hotel staff. In the front row, Alexandra sat beside Sarah Martinez, both women now key members of the management team. "Last week, Richard Morrison was sentenced to 30 years in prison," Margaret continued, "for the murder of my parents, for his wife's death, and for his financial crimes. Justice was served, but that's not the end of our story." She unveiled the new employee profit-sharing numbers on the screen behind her. Gasps and applause filled the room as people saw their futures changing in real time. "The Blackwood Morrison Foundation will ensure this company never forgets its values again," Margaret announced. Alexandra joined her at the podium, confidence replacing her former arrogance. "Our first initiative is building affordable housing for hotel workers," she said. "No employee of this company will ever struggle to pay rent again." James Chen watched from the back, smiling proudly. He'd refused a management position, preferring to stay in maintenance where he could keep his eyes and ears open. Old habits die hard. After the ceremony, Margaret found herself back in the employee break room. It still had the same cheap coffee maker, the same worn tables. She'd ordered them kept exactly as they were. "Keeping you humble?" Sarah asked, joining her with a styrofoam cup. "Keeping me honest," Margaret replied. "This room holds more truth than any boardroom ever could." Detective Brooks stopped by later with final case updates. Morrison had started talking, implicating others in his schemes. The investigation was spreading to other companies, exposing decades of corporate corruption. "You could have taken revenge at any time," he said. "Why wait so long?" "Because revenge wouldn't have changed the system," Margaret answered. "Real change takes time, and proof, and people willing to stand up for what's right." That evening, Margaret visited her parents' graves. She hadn't been able to come here while maintaining her cover, but now she could finally tell them everything. "The company is thriving," she said softly. "Not just profitable, but ethical, the way you always wanted." She placed flowers on both graves. "And your granddaughter is doing amazing work." Alexandra had legally changed her name to Blackwood Morrison, honoring both her past and her future. She worked twice as hard as anyone else, determined to prove herself worthy of her second chance. As Margaret drove back to the hotel, she thought about second chances. She'd given one to Alexandra, to the company, and finally to herself. The weight of her double life was gone, replaced by the lighter burden of leading with compassion. The night guard tipped his hat as she entered. "Evening, Miss Blackwood." "Evening, Joe," she replied, then smiled. "Actually, you can still call me Peggy." Because in the end, both names were truly her. The heiress and the housekeeper, the leader and the listener, the victor who chose justice over vengeance. That was her real legacy. 1 year after the revelation that shook Boston's business world, the Blackwood Hospitality Group had become a model for corporate responsibility. Magazines that once featured Richard Morrison's empire now showcased Margaret's transformation of the company. "Another article about the undercover heiress?" Alexandra asked, dropping a magazine on Margaret's desk. The cover showed Margaret in her old housekeeper's uniform next to a photo of her in business attire. "At least they're finally focusing on the changes we've made," Margaret replied, scanning the article. Not just the scandal. Their latest initiative had made headlines. Full college scholarships for employees' children. The first round of recipients included the daughter of Maria, a housekeeper Margaret had worked alongside for 20 years. "The other hotel chains are scrambling to copy our employee benefits," Alexandra reported. "Funny how treating people well is suddenly good business." A knock interrupted them. James Chen entered with Sarah Martinez, both looking serious. "We found something in the old records," Sarah said. Morrison wasn't working alone. Some board members from other hotels were involved in the original takeover. Margaret sighed. "How many?" "3. All still in positions of power." James placed a file on her desk. "They're nervous, making moves to protect themselves." "They should be nervous," Alexandra said sharply, but Margaret held up her hand. "We'll handle this legally," she said. "No shortcuts, no revenge. Like you handled my father." Alexandra's voice softened. "Sometimes I still don't understand how you did it. Watched him every day, knowing what he did to your parents." Margaret stood and walked to the window. The hotel's garden below had been redesigned to include a memorial fountain for all they'd lost. Her parents, Alexandra's mother, and the years stolen from both of them. "Hatred consumes you," she said finally. "Justice transforms you. I chose transformation." Later that afternoon, Margaret visited the employee dining room, not the executive one she could now use. Staff members smiled warmly, no longer surprised to see her there. She was still Peggy to many of them, and she preferred it that way. "The new healthcare plan saved my son's life," a dishwasher told her tearfully. "The surgery would have bankrupted us before." Stories like these made everything worth it. Every year of scrubbing floors, every moment of swallowing her pride, every careful step toward this outcome. That evening, Margaret led her first board meeting at the National Hotel Association. The same people who once dismissed housekeepers now hung on her every word. But power wasn't her goal, change was. "The future of hospitality isn't in luxury," she told them. "It's in dignity, for guests and employees alike." As she drove home, Margaret passed the courthouse where Richard Morrison had been sentenced. His empire of greed had crumbled, but from its ruins, something better had grown. Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexandra. "First scholarship student just graduated nursing school. Thought you'd want to know." Margaret smiled. This was her parents' true legacy. Not the hotels, but the lives changed within them. Not revenge, but renewal. The next morning, she'd be back in her office, building that legacy further. But she'd never forget the lessons learned pushing a cleaning cart through these halls. Sometimes the best view of a broken system comes from the bottom, and sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the power to fix it all. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret stood in the hotel's newly renovated lobby, watching the dedication ceremony for the Catherine Morrison Memorial Library, a learning center for employees and their families. A portrait of Alexandra's mother smiled down at the gathering, her eyes kind and determined. "Mom would have loved this," Alexandra whispered, standing beside Margaret. "A place where people can learn, grow, better themselves." The first users of the library would be employees studying for their hospitality management degrees through the company's education program. Already, 50 staff members had enrolled. Detective Brooks arrived just as the ceremony ended. "Thought you'd want to know. We arrested the last of Morrison's conspirators this morning. The whole network is finally exposed." Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "And the evidence about Catherine's death?" "Solid. They can't hide behind suicide anymore. Your testimony about what you observed during those years was crucial." A group of housekeepers passed by pushing their cleaning carts. Margaret found herself straightening their path out of habit, then caught herself with a smile. "Old habits," she said to Alexandra's questioning look. "You miss it sometimes, don't you?" Alexandra asked. "Being Peggy." "I was always Margaret," she replied. "Peggy just helped me remember what really matters." Sarah Martinez interrupted with urgent news. Their employee housing project had just received city approval. Construction would begin next month. "The other hotel chains are still complaining that we're disrupting the industry," Sarah reported. "Good," Margaret and Alexandra said simultaneously, then laughed. That afternoon, Margaret visited the employee break room again. The old coffee maker had finally been replaced, but she'd insisted the worn tables stay. James Chen found her there, staring at the blank wall where she used to watch Alexandra color as a child. "The mechanic who confessed about your parents' plane," he said quietly. "He passed away last night. Natural causes. At least he lived to see justice done." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Another chapter ending, another piece of the past laid to rest. "You know what I learned in 35 years of watching?" she asked. "Power doesn't corrupt people. Fear does. Fear of losing power, fear of being exposed, fear of not being enough. And now?" James asked. "Now we build something stronger than fear. We build hope." That evening, as sunset painted the Boston skyline, Margaret stood in her office, once her father's office. On her desk sat 3 photos: her parents, Catherine Morrison, and one of herself in her housekeeper's uniform. Alexandra entered with their latest financial reports. The company's profits had actually increased since implementing their sweeping changes. Turns out, treating people well was good business after all. "Ready for tomorrow's board meeting?" Alexandra asked. "The expansion plan is controversial. Building affordable housing instead of luxury hotels usually is," Margaret smiled. "But we're not here to do what's easy. We're here to do what's right." She looked out at the city lights coming on, just like she had done thousands of times while cleaning these offices. But now, she wasn't watching from the shadows. She was lighting the way for others. "You know what the best revenge turned out to be," she said softly. "Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just winning, but changing the game entirely." As mother and adopted daughter stood together, watching their city sparkle, the past finally felt at peace. The long game was over, justice had won, and the future was bright with possibility. The Grand Plaza Hotel would always be Margaret's home, not because she owned it, but because she had earned it, one cleaned room at a time. 2 years to the day after Margaret reclaimed her identity, she stood in the hotel's grand ballroom, now renamed the Blackwood Hall. Today marked the graduation of their first class of employees from the company's education program. "When I think about justice," Margaret addressed the graduates, "I remember something my father used to say. Success isn't about rising to the top. It's about lifting others as you climb." 50 employees, including housekeepers, maintenance workers, and kitchen staff, sat in their caps and gowns. Their families beamed from the audience. In the front row, Maria's daughter clutched her nursing degree. "Each of you represents what's possible when opportunity meets determination," Margaret continued. "You've earned this, not just your degrees, but your place in our company's future." News cameras rolled as Margaret announced that each graduate would receive a management position within the company. The room erupted in cheers and tears. Richard Morrison watched the ceremony from his prison cell, the broadcast a reminder of everything he'd lost. His appeals had all been denied. Justice in the end had been perfect. Later that day, Margaret met with Detective Brooks one final time. The investigation into the corporate conspiracy had concluded. All the guilty parties were behind bars. "They found Catherine Morrison's diary," he told her. "It proves everything. She was gathering evidence against her husband right until—" Alexandra, listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "Until he killed her, we can say it now. The truth is better than silence." That evening, Margaret walked through the hotel's halls, remembering her years as Peggy. Each corner held a memory. Conversations overheard, documents discovered, pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. James Chen joined her walk. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About waiting so long?" "Not anymore," Margaret replied. "Quick revenge would have changed nothing. This way, we changed everything." They passed the employee daycare center, filled with children whose parents could now work without worry. Beyond that, through the windows, the first buildings of their employee housing complex rose against the sky. Sarah Martinez was waiting in Margaret's office with their latest initiative, a program to help other companies transform their corporate culture. "They're calling it the Blackwood Method," Sarah said, showing her the proposal. "Teaching ethics from the ground up. More like from the basement up," Alexandra added with a smile. Margaret touched the frame of her old employee ID badge now hanging on her office wall. 35 years as a housekeeper taught me more about leadership than any business school could." The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of justice, long delayed but finally delivered. In her mind, Margaret could see her parents smiling. Their legacy lived on, stronger than ever. The best view of a broken system comes from the bottom, she said softly. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who will change everything. Alexandra hugged her suddenly. Thank you, she whispered, for showing me a better way. Together, they watched the city lights come on, just as Margaret had done countless times while pushing her cleaning cart. But now those lights didn't represent power or wealth. They represented possibility. The story of the hotel maid who became CEO would be told for years to come. But for Margaret, the real story wasn't about reclaiming power. It was about redefining it. Justice, she had learned, was not about punishment. It was about transformation, not just of a company, but of hearts and minds. One person, one decision, one day at a time. And in the end, that was the most perfect justice of all. 5 years after Margaret Blackwood's revelation shook the business world, she stood in the Grand Plaza Hotel's rooftop garden, hosting a very special event. The company's original employees, those who had worked alongside her during her years as Peggy, were retiring with full pensions and ownership shares. Each of you taught me something about dignity, Margaret told the group. About doing your job with pride, no matter what that job is. Maria, her old cleaning partner, hugged her tearfully. You changed our lives, Peggy. I mean, Miss Blackwood. To you, I'll always be Peggy, Margaret smiled. The Blackwood Hospitality Group had become America's most respected hotel chain, not for its luxury, but for its ethics. Other companies regularly sent executives to learn their methods, starting in housekeeping, just as Margaret had. Alexandra, now COO, joined her mother at the podium. Today we're announcing something special, she said. The Peggy Thompson Scholarship, providing full university education for the children of hotel workers across the country. The crowd applauded as Margaret unveiled the program's details. It would help thousands of families break the cycle of poverty. Later that evening, Detective Brooks made his last official visit before retirement. The final appeal was rejected, he reported. Richard Morrison will spend the rest of his life in prison. And the others? Margaret asked. All his conspirators will serve their full sentences. Justice is complete. Margaret nodded, feeling no satisfaction, only peace. Revenge had never been her goal. Change was. In her office, she found James Chen waiting with Sarah Martinez. They'd been with her from the beginning, loyal friends who helped her maintain her cover and gather evidence. Remember your first day as a housekeeper? James asked. You could barely make a bed. Now she's teaching CEOs how to make beds, Sarah laughed. Margaret picked up an old photo from her desk, herself in her cleaning uniform, taken decades ago. I learned more pushing that cart than I ever did in business school. Alexandra entered with their latest figures. Employee satisfaction was at record highs. Turnover was nearly zero. Profits were strong. The other hotel chains still can't figure out our secret, Alexandra said. That's because they're looking from the top down, Margaret replied. Real change happens from the bottom up. That night, after everyone had gone, Margaret walked the hotel's halls one last time. Each corner held memories, both painful and precious. The security guard tipped his hat. Evening, Peggy, he said. Evening, Joe, she replied, smiling at the familiar exchange. Tomorrow she would announce her retirement, passing leadership to Alexandra. The company was in good hands. The system had been changed. Justice had been served. But more importantly, lives had been transformed. Not through revenge or power, but through patience, perseverance, and the quiet dignity of honest work. As she looked out over the Boston skyline one final time from her office window, Margaret whispered a quiet thank you to her parents, to the people who helped her, and even to the job that taught her everything. The story of the hotel maid who became CEO would be told for generations. But its lesson wasn't about wealth or power or even justice. It was about dignity, about seeing people, really seeing them, about changing things from the inside out. And that was worth every one of those 35 years. Good night, Margaret said softly to the hotel that had been both her prison and her salvation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new chances to make a difference. But tonight, she was simply grateful. For justice served, for lessons learned, and for the perfect view from the bottom that had shown her how to fix it all. On the morning of her retirement announcement, Margaret arrived early at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The lobby was quiet, sunlight streaming through the windows onto the memorial fountain. She paused to read the plaque. In memory of Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood and Catherine Morrison, truth will always rise. As she made her way to the conference room, employees stopped to greet her. Not with the fearful deference they once showed Morrison, but with genuine warmth. "The press is already gathering," Alexandra reported, meeting her at the elevator. "Everyone wants to hear the Hotel Maid CEO's final speech." Margaret straightened her daughter's collar, a maternal gesture that still surprised them both sometimes. "Are you ready for this?" "Thanks to you, I am," Alexandra replied, "though I still can't match your skill at making hospital corners." The retirement announcement was more than just a leadership transition. It was the final proof that their transformation was complete. The Blackwood Hospitality Group had become a case study in ethical business practices taught in universities worldwide. "There's something you should know," Sarah Martinez said, pulling Margaret aside before the press conference. "We found Morrison's private files. He didn't act alone in Catherine's death. There were board members involved." "Have you told Alexandra?" "Not yet. We thought you should decide." Margaret watched her daughter greeting board members, confident and composed. The truth about her mother's death had nearly broken her once, but she was stronger now. "Tell her after the announcement," Margaret decided. "She can handle it, and justice isn't finished until every truth is told." The press conference began. Cameras flashed as Margaret took the podium one last time, but instead of announcing her retirement first, she had another revelation to share. "Today, the Blackwood Group is launching the largest employee housing initiative in corporate history," she announced. "Every hotel worker in our company will have the opportunity to own their own home." The room erupted in chaos as reporters shouted questions. Margaret held up her hand for silence. "I learned as a housekeeper that a hotel is more than just a building. It's a community, and communities take care of their own." She went on to announce her retirement and Alexandra's succession. But it was the housing initiative that dominated the headlines. Once again, they had changed the game. Later, in the employee break room, Margaret had coffee with Maria one last time. The cheap coffee maker was still there. Alexandra had tried to replace it, but the staff insisted on keeping it. "Remember when you first started?" Maria asked. "You were so clumsy with the cleaning cart." "I was playing a role," Margaret smiled. "No," Maria shook her head. "You were learning what really matters." That evening, Margaret and Alexandra visited Catherine's grave. They had new flowers to place and new truths to tell. More people were involved in Mom's death. Alexandra said quietly, "But you already knew that, didn't you?" "I suspected. It's why I waited so long to act. I needed all the truth, not just parts of it." Alexandra touched the gravestone. "What do we do now?" "What we always do," Margaret replied. "We seek justice, not revenge. We change things from within. We honor the truth by living it." As they walked back to the car, Alexandra asked, "Will you really stay away after retirement?" Margaret laughed. "I spent 35 years cleaning this hotel. Do you really think I can stop checking for dust now?" The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new truths, new chances for justice. But tonight, watching her daughter walk ahead of her strong and sure, Margaret knew that her work, her real work, was finally complete. The maid had become a CEO. The CEO had become a changemaker. And the changemaker had become something even more important. A mother who showed her daughter that true power comes from lifting others up. That was a legacy worth every moment of those 35 years. And it was only the beginning. 10 years had passed since Margaret first revealed her true identity. The Grand Plaza Hotel hosted a special anniversary celebration, but not in the opulent ballroom. Instead, people gathered in the employee break room, where it all began, where a humble housekeeper had quietly plotted the reclamation of justice. "This room taught me more about leadership than any boardroom," Margaret told the crowd, her hand resting on the old table where she'd spent countless lunch breaks. Because real change happens where real people gather, where true stories are shared, and where dignity lives in the smallest gestures. The old coffee maker held a place of honor, now displayed in a glass case. Beside it, photos showed Margaret in her cleaning uniform through the years, silent witness to decades of secrets. Each image told a story. Peggy kneeling to help a lost child, Peggy training new staff members, Peggy quietly observing Morrison's empire from the shadows. People ask why we kept this break room exactly as it was, Margaret continued. They expect marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but this room represents something more valuable than luxury. It represents authenticity. Alexandra, now firmly established as CEO, shared stories of her own transformation. Her voice carried across the packed room, reaching even those standing in the hallway. "I was the spoiled rich girl who threw coffee at the Maid," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I was everything wrong with corporate America, entitled, cruel, blind to the humanity of others. Now I understand that true character isn't about what you have, but what you give. My mother taught me that. Both my mothers." She looked at Margaret, then up at her birth mother's portrait on the wall. Catherine Morrison's gentle eyes seemed to approve of her daughter's journey from privileged princess to compassionate leader. Detective Brooks, long retired but still sharp as ever, made his way through the crowd to Margaret and Alexandra. Age had whitened his hair, but his eyes held the same determination they'd shown when he first reopened the Blackwood case. "The last of Catherine's killers confessed," he announced quietly. 3 former board members. They couldn't live with the guilt anymore. The whole truth is finally out. More than justice, it was closure. Alexandra squeezed Margaret's hand, both women thinking of Catherine's portrait watching over the library that bore her name. The truth had taken its time, but it had finally emerged into the light. James Chen, still steadfastly refusing any promotion from his maintenance position, brought out an old cleaning cart, the same one Margaret had used during her years undercover. Its wheels still squeaked slightly, a sound that had once accompanied her quiet gathering of evidence. "Should we see if the CEO remembers how to use this?" he teased, holding out a cleaning rag. "I could still out-clean any of you," Margaret laughed, stepping forward to demonstrate perfect bed-making technique to applause and cheers. Her hands hadn't forgotten the movements, muscle memory developed over decades of careful work. Sarah Martinez presented the latest figures, her pride evident as she detailed their accomplishments. The employee housing program had spread nationwide, with other companies following their lead. The Blackwood method had become a movement, transforming corporate culture across industries. "We didn't just change a company," Sarah said, displaying charts showing the impact of their initiatives. "We changed an industry, and more importantly, we changed lives." The statistics told an impressive story. 0 employee homelessness, 100% healthcare coverage, children of hotel workers graduating college at record rates. But the real success wasn't in the numbers, it was in the faces of the people gathered in that break room. As evening fell, Margaret found herself alone in her old cleaning closet, the small space where she'd sometimes hidden to cry, to plan, to pray for strength to keep going. The shelves still held cleaning supplies, the scent of lemon polish still lingering in the air. "Mom." Alexandra found her there. "Everyone's looking for you. The TV crews want one more interview." "Just remembering," Margaret replied, running her hand along the worn shelf. "This closet kept more secrets than any vault. It's where I hid the evidence about your mother's death, where I stored the documents that would eventually expose everything." Together they walked the quiet halls one last time. Every corner held memories, of justice delayed but not denied, of truth hidden but finally revealed, of love lost and found again. They passed the spot where Alexandra had thrown that fateful cup of coffee, now marked with a small plaque, "Where Change Begins." At the memorial fountain in the courtyard, they stopped to read the newest addition to the plaque. "The perfect view comes from the bottom." Water trickled peacefully over the names of those who had died in pursuit of truth. Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, Catherine Morrison. "You really never wanted revenge?" Alexandra asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "All those years, watching him, watching me, never made you want to hurt us back." "Revenge hurts everyone," Margaret answered, touching the cool marble of the fountain. "Justice heals everyone. That's what your mother taught me, watching her fight for truth. She could have exposed your father at any time, but she wanted proof of everything, wanted to protect you from the fallout. She chose justice over revenge, too." Outside, Boston's lights twinkled just as they had all those nights Margaret spent cleaning. But now they symbolized something different. Not power to be reclaimed, but hope to be shared. Each light represented a life touched by their work, a family lifted out of poverty, a child given opportunities their parents never had. The Blackwood legacy would continue through Alexandra, through their foundations, through lives changed and dignity restored. The story of the hotel maid who became CEO would inspire generations, not as a tale of revenge served cold, but as proof that patience and principle could transform even the most broken systems. New employees would learn about Margaret's 35 years undercover, not as a story of deception, but as a lesson in the power of perspective. They would understand that true leadership means seeing from every angle, especially from the bottom, ready to go home. Alexandra asked, noting how tired her mother looked after the long day of celebrations. Margaret looked around one final time at the hotel that had been her battlefield and her classroom, her burden and her redemption. Every tile, every door, every corner held memories, some bitter, some sweet, all part of a journey that had changed countless lives. "I am home," she said softly. "I always was. This place, these people, they're what home really means. Not ownership, but belonging." Because sometimes the longest road leads right back to where you started, but with perfect vision earned from the view at the bottom, with wisdom gained from years of patient observation, with strength built through daily acts of quiet dignity. The grand lobby began to empty as the celebration wound down. Tomorrow, work would resume as usual. Beds would be made, floors would be cleaned, guests would be served. But now every task would be performed with pride, every worker valued as part of something greater than themselves. That was her real legacy. Not the buildings that bore the Blackwood name, not the billions in recovered assets, not even the justice finally delivered. Her legacy lived in the dignity restored to every worker, in the opportunities created for their children, in the proof that power could be wielded with compassion. And it would live on, shining as bright as the stars now appearing over Boston, guiding others toward justice, truth, and the courage to change everything. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room, the one no one notices, the one cleaning up others' messes, is the one who sees everything most clearly. That perfect view from the bottom had shown her how to fix it all. And now, looking up at the stars, Margaret knew that view would keep showing others the way forward, one restored dignity at a time.